I like to have the arm off the bed or if the patient's seated, otherwise in a downward position. Because gravity is your friend. Gravity will push the blood to the fingertips. Now, assuming you're putting the IV in the antecubital space, which is really the preferred spot, say if you're giving blood or insulin or you need to establish an IV line for a CAT scan with IV contrast, you're going to want to have the arm facing downward. You're going to put a tourniquet a few inches above the spot. And if they're a hard stick, I like to put a tourniquet below as well. The key to establishing the IV line is to aggravate the vein. So by having a tourniquet above and below, I'm aggravating that vein. I especially like this technique on geriatric patients because even if you establish the IV, you're going to need 6, 7, sometimes 8 vials of blood, including cultures, depending on the patient's status. The double tourniquet technique will not only aggravate the vein and make it easier to find it, it pools the blood in the periphery. And it doesn't have to be a geriatric patient. It could be any patient who has low blood volume. It could be from hemorrhaging, or most likely it's going to be dehydration. Another benefit to the double tourniquet technique is that, say you can't get the vein, right? You've already primed the hand. So you can remove the top tourniquet, leave the bottom one on. Now you can search the hand, the wrist, the forearm, and no time has been wasted. So this is a 20 gauge IV needle. You take the cap off. If I move slowly and carefully, as you can see, this is the needle. This is the actual catheter. Bendable piece of plastic. You always want to go bevel up. Upon getting flash, you're going to see it go through the catheter a little bit into the chamber. You're going to push the catheter in. Once it goes in like a few millimeters, that's when you're going to retract the needle. I'll get to that. What I like to do before I put an IV in, I like to make sure that the catheter is actually loose. I like to turn it. You're probably not going to see that in the hospital, but if you're an EMT in an ambulance, certainly if you're a Navy hospital corpsman like myself, an Army medic, or any kind of medic in the armed forces, you have a med bag, you don't know how hot or how cold the environment's going to be. Sometimes these catheters, they get stuck. You know, the plastic might get a little fused. Have my 30 degrees, pierce the vein, drop down to 10. As I push the catheter in, they all have a button right here, right there. As you push the catheter in, you're going to press the button and the needle's retracted. And again, you're just using the catheter and bendable piece of plastic. You're never going to have a full-length needle in the vein. So when people say, oh, this IV is uncomfortable, the needle, it's hurting, it's just a piece of plastic. When your IV is established, the catheter is in the vein, the extension tubing is hooked directly to the catheter. This part's going to be inside the body. This is what's going to be sticking out. Whenever you place the tourniquet on, you don't want to tie it like a shoelace. You're going to pinch the skin, and it's just not going to be as tight as it needs to be. You want to stretch it first and lift up. Then, without ever touching the skin, you're going to loop it through and drop it. This especially works well because when you need to loosen it or take it off, you just pull. With the tourniquet in place and the patient's arm tilted downward, remember gravity is your friend here, you're going to take the chlorhexidine or rubbing alcohol and coat the arm. Okay, you'd coat the arm if this patient were a tough stick, which she clearly isn't, but we're pretending. Beneath the light, you'll notice the rub reveals the skin's contours and shadows. This often exposes the veins underneath despite no visible presence on the surface. We're using a venipuncture device for the demonstration, so you won't see flash, but we can simulate everything else. With the 20 gauge IV needle in my hand, I'm first going to perform a catheter check. That puppy is loose, Bravo Zulu. After palpating, plant your thumb behind the needle, never ahead. You don't want to poke yourself. Bevel up, approach at a 30-degree angle. Once the bevel's in, and this is where you'd see flash by the way, drop down to 10 degrees. Push in the needle a few more millimeters and stop. Move on to the catheter and slide it in as you retract the needle. With your thumb, occlude the vein above the site. Many healthcare providers will attach the vacutainer directly to the catheter, place a gauze underneath to absorb any spillage, and with the vacutainer attached, they'll draw labs. I don't prefer this technique for a few reasons. One, it can be messy. And let's just say I've seen more than a little spillage come out of these catheters. If it looks sloppy to me, it looks sloppy to the patient. And my job is to instill confidence. Two, I've seen veins bloat due to the direct pressure placed on the catheter by healthcare providers, especially if the patient or the patient's environment is moving. I prefer a closed system when drawing labs, which is why I don't flush the extension tubing with saline when I know I'm collecting blood. The nurse dad technique is to attach the extension tubing right to the catheter, as you would after collecting blood the other way. From here you can do anything, it's a closed system. You can go to lunch, spillage is not an option. But remember, there's air in the line for blood collection. The next step is to attach the vacutainer to the extension tubing and watch the blood flow from the body to the vial. If you weren't drawing labs, you would have flushed the line before sticking the patient. If the extension tubing was already flushed with saline, you could still draw labs. Simply waste the first vial of blood collected. The same procedure for drawing new labs from an old IV. FYI, there are IV needles with the extension tubing automatically attached. I've used them, though I don't often see them. What if you can't advance the catheter very far? You don't need to establish the IV line in order to collect blood. You could do the second part first. Then, with a technique I'll show you, establish the line. If you don't need blood work but can't advance the catheter, this technique's for you too. If you can only advance the catheter a few millimeters after noting flash, stop, attach the extension tubing like I showed you previously, and collect your blood work. Note the double tourniquet, pooling blood locally, thus expanding the vessel. The catheter may be pliable plastic, but for these hard stick squiggly veins, they sometimes require a little finesse. Take your saline flush, attach it directly to the catheter or the extension tubing, and as you slowly flush, gently advance the catheter. Because it is, after all, bendable plastic. And with the help of saline, it can take on the shape of the vessel. I utilize this technique 20 to 30% of the time. Until next time, nurse dad out.